Hi, everyone, and welcome to Project Ocean's Wellness Series. My name is Valena. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a Project Ocean peer educator. One thing that has been extremely relevant nowadays is stress. Stress from the pandemic, the elections, academics, financial circumstances, interpersonal relationships, and more. Something that had piqued my interest is stress in a cultural and familial aspect. And so this leads me to the focus of today's episode, which is called Stress Through the Lens of Intergenerational Trauma, Culture, and Family. I'd also like to introduce a guest today who is going to be speaking about our topic, Alyssa Hufana. Alyssa is a doctoral intern at CSULB CAPS and a fifth year PhD candidate in counseling, clinical, and school psychology at UC Santa Barbara. Alyssa has previously worked in university counseling centers and intensive outpatient settings in her clinical work, and she also specializes in resilience and wellness from a multicultural and social justice lens, holistic ways of understanding pain and healing, prevention, substance abuse, Filipino American psychology, and working with Asian American and Pacific Islander populations. She was awarded the prestigious American Psychological Association Minority Fellowship from 2018 to 2020. And lastly, when she's not at CAPS, Alyssa enjoys the outdoors, camping, visiting national parks, and all things plants. So, welcome to Project Ocean's Wellness Series, Alyssa.
Thanks, Valena. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited. When we do think about stress and family, um, and also culture, the topic of intergenerational trauma can be something that isn't commonly acknowledged or even something that people may be aware of. I personally became more aware of this topic as I transitioned into my peer educator role. And so I do want to go into what intergenerational trauma is. So, according to a systematic review from the Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health in 2016, intergenerational trauma is a term for how trauma experienced in one generation affects the health and well being of descendants of future generations. And so, one negative effect of intergenerational trauma is potentially being more vulnerable to stress. Alyssa, would you be able to elaborate on what intergenerational trauma is?
Yeah, absolutely. A term, like you had said earlier, intergenerational trauma is not something that is typically known by a lot of people. I think we hear the word stress that comes up in our everyday lives between conversations with friends and families, at work and at school. And yet, linking it to this idea of intergenerational trauma is really unheard of. I think it's really interesting that we can think of trauma as the idea that it can be passed down from people or persons who at first experience a terrible event. For example, a grandfather or grandmother who went to war, who fled a war-torn country, or even suffered or had an unexpected loss. And so a lot of people can see how that can really take effect not only on the person, but their descendants and current day people who are experiencing a lot of stress and traumatic responses to that. I think it's interesting because intergenerational trauma is something that first started in the 1960s. And so it actually started when psychologists were studying the, aftermath and responses to children and grandchildren who were Holocaust survivors. And so if that's any indication of how intergenerational trauma and the field of this has come to the surface, I think it's something to be aware of. And it's the idea that, there also is a biological component, that there's evidence out there of epigenetics that says that trauma can actually alter the way that we can react and behave in life. So like you had said, Valena, just this vulnerability and sensitivity to stress has been actually linked to people's genes. And so if this is to be true, then we need to understand the ways in which, we ourselves or others have really experienced stress from this trauma lens and from a way that not only deals with us, but our parents, our grandparents, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what intergenerational trauma is. And also factoring the reality that many of these things comes from, historical events that have long impacted generations that are to come.
Yeah, thanks so much. I definitely think this is such a fascinating thing because when it comes to family passing down traits and genes, a lot of people think about like genetics, but it also has to do with the social and like interpersonal practices and routines slash like the way we cope with our emotions. That can also be passed down from generation to generation. And so this leads me to my next question, which is what stressors and symptoms of stress are associated with intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, it really can vary by generations and individuals. I think it's important to think about individual people and their reactions and responses to stress. But when you really factor in intergenerational trauma, a lot of symptoms can really show up. And I think, oftentimes many may think it's merely anxiety and depression, the way that we may talk about in everyday life right now. Or just someone being really extremely sensitive to stress or heightened to a lot of sensory things. But, if you think again about it from the lens of trauma, that it really does take a toll on your biological, emotional, and behavioral aspects of understanding yourself. And so, as far as the stress and what may show up, a lot of things in traumatic stress responses can be the following. So, having a lot of shame, some increased anxiety and guilt. At times, people have talked about low self esteem, high risk as far as suicidality, substance abuse, impulsivity to high risk behaviors. Some people can also think about it as negative, intrusive thoughts. But I think one of the more interesting things that intergenerational trauma introduces is the relational aspect of things. So, for example, those who may experience symptoms of stress from such traumas could have difficulty with relationships and attachment, and also difficulty regulating their emotions like anger or aggression, and have extreme reactivity to stress. And so, as far as intergenerational trauma goes, and from that lens, I think those are things that are really important to note that, for example, if you take, one a grandfather who fought in World War II. And the way of coping was one, not talking about the things that he may have seen or they may have seen and had to do, but coped as a way through maybe alcohol use or other substance use that then became in a sense, normalized way of coping with a lot of traumatic things that got passed down. And so that introduces the idea of alcoholism and, not finding the language to talk about difficult things. And that's just one example. But as you can see, it kind of stems from a lot of different pathways and routes to experiencing stress.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I know that when older generations tend to have coping mechanisms such as emotionally distancing themselves or becoming defensive around expressing emotions, this can definitely come off as something that can be normal to the future generations. And because of this, this is how it's passed down from generation to generation. Just learning from that social behavior, that coping behavior can be learned and can be continued. And so how can we cope with such stressors and heal from this type of intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, I think, when I bring up and we talk about these stressors and how they show up, I think one thing to note is that it's neither good or bad, but if you think about it from a cultural lens, that many times that was the way of survival. And so I think the challenge is understanding what the stresses are, that there actually has been, either family patterns of substance use as a way of coping, or we just ignore, talking about difficult emotions, or there's other ways to go about it. And so I think once recognizing it, we can then decide to heal from it and cope with it. And I think the biggest way we can really start is building some self-awareness around, your experiences or the experiences of others in regards to this type of stress and traumatic, response to stress. Understanding your own triggers and symptoms is honestly, I think, a good place to start. And so, due to the nature of the different types of traumas that folks have either encountered or their ancestors have encountered, it's going to look different for everyone. But I am going to, ask folks to consider, what happens when I feel unsafe? What do I notice in my thoughts, in my emotions, in my body that occurs? And what do I tend to do when that happens? So these are some questions to start to think about, yourself or even for others, as you start to think about stress maybe from this lens. I think another piece that's really important, the second piece being, education for yourself. And so that's going to probably mean, consider your own personal family history and or the social political histories of which your ancestors came from. If this is an accessible and available aspect of, your life for you. I know many families don't have that ability, or people don't have that ability to access, but if you do, what have been the historical events that have impacted my culture and my family and ancestors? What is the personal family history that I am aware of or may not be aware of? And, how does my family and I cope with, trauma and culture and difficult emotions? Do we tend to laugh it off and make jokes about it? Do we just not talk about it at all? And so I think really paying attention to that, if folks are ready, is an area to look into. Lastly, I really think establishing a sense of safety for yourself and others is going to be the key to unlock a lot of the healing. And many times trauma is linked to feelings of unsafety, and that can come in many forms: physical, emotional, societal safety. And so, for folks listening to this who may connect with this topic, I really encourage them to pay attention to the whole self. So, what is it that helps me feel safe physically? Am I in danger? Do I feel like I'm in danger? Emotionally, who can I show up with and be myself and let my guard down? Structurally or societally, am I in a workspace or classes or interactions with people where I don't feel like I can be seen and heard? And maybe you may not be able to get in out of those situations right away, but I think building some awareness and creating an action plan for you, if that's necessary, is something to look into. And lastly, with all this being said, it's a pretty heavy topic and pretty intense to kind of build awareness on. So knowing when you need to ask for help and support. And this is, my last point that I wanted to be really clear about, that looking for help and support doesn't necessarily mean looking at mental health services or professional services. As a mental health professional myself, I encourage that if, working through such stressors and potential trauma, how that shows up for you and your relationships, I encourage you to, see a therapist or make an appointment if that's something you might find helpful. And in other ways, intergenerational trauma, I think, truly really calls for healing in the community. So what is that going to look like? It may mean getting connected to cultural groups or different groups that you feel you can be safe with, who've either had similar experiences or you feel like you can be heard and seen, and start to build some relationships there where some communal healing can happen, because I don't think that this particular stress or feelings of stress are necessarily can be done on your own. And so I do encourage really connecting with others, especially in these uncertain times. We have a lot going on that maybe connection and social connection is a really big key.
I love that you emphasize the connection component of healing. I think going through this alone is something that can be really difficult, and not having a system that can support you, or even a community that may understand what you're going through, can feel really isolating, and it could be hard to cope with the trauma and stress. And so I totally agree with you about how awareness is so important. Having that awareness of triggers, of when you feel unsafe, or even understanding just the history of trauma, and releasing that pain from the trauma and stress. And so I think you make a great point about becoming aware and having knowledge, in order to be in more control of how that type of stress and trauma can affect us. And so, thank you so much, Alyssa. I did have one last question. Do you know of any good resources that can help with the stress, and how to deal or heal from intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, I think there are so many resources out there when we think about how to identify stress, coping with stress. But I think for those who are interested in thinking about stress as it relates to trauma, I really recommend a wonderful book, and it's called The Body Keeps the Score. So it's the brain, mind, and body and the healing of trauma. And this is a wonderful book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is an experienced, medical doctor, who was a founder of the Trauma Center in Brookline, Massachusetts, and they're also a professor of psychiatry, and they do a wonderful job walking through various narratives and instances of historical trauma and the ways it can actually show up in folks from a, medical and biological perspective, from a psychological one, and talking about societal structures too. And so for folks who are more interested and feel like, maybe I just want to learn more and I'm not ready to dive in just yet, I really do recommend this book as a potential starting point for folks.
Yeah, I love book recommendations, and I would totally check this book out just to learn more about the intergenerational trauma, and how to cope with such stressors. And so, did you happen to have any other resources that you think would be beneficial when dealing with stress?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember saying earlier that awareness is key. And I think a beautiful way that you can access that is, through the work of mindfulness. And a lot of the work has been done by, in the Western world, at least the way we know it today in the US, by Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. And, if folks go to uclahealth.org, they can access a lot of free podcasts, apps, and guided meditations that can really start to facilitate this idea for yourself around, just becoming aware of the present moment in a non-judgmental and a compassionate way. And I think that's a wonderful way to start, particularly for folks who are dealing with trauma that many times feel very disconnected from their mind and their body and their spirit. And so to become more aware of it and to do it in a loving and compassionate way could be a helpful tool for folks too.
Yeah, mindfulness is something that can be so healing. I know that for me, yoga is relaxing. It helps me recenter myself and just focus again. And so this sounds like such a great resource, and I'm glad that it's accessible online. So thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Alyssa. Yeah, but those are all the questions that I had for today. Did you have any other messages that you wanted to share?
Yeah, thanks, Valena. The only other thing I feel like I'm going to end on is that, a topic such like this and listening, as you listen to this podcast today, it's only the beginning. And I hope this sparks curiosity to do some more self-study and learning on your own, but also have conversations with folks you feel comfortable with. And I think, especially in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty and unrest, I think a lot of the healing, again, can be done in community. and showing up for yourself and showing up for others. And so I do encourage, the being kind to yourself when it comes to such kind of overwhelming times, and also overwhelming, discoveries when it comes to trauma and dealing with it. So I would say, just as much as the interest is there, I also encourage you to also start some practices or look around this idea of self-compassion.
Thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Just being able to connect with yourself, being able to connect with your community is something that can be so powerful and definitely healing. And so I just want to thank you again, Alyssa, for joining me on this podcast. And thank you so much for explaining what stress looks like when it comes to culture, family, and intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. So, the takeaway message is to educate ourselves about our triggers of stress and trauma and consider our family history. We can use this time to connect with ourselves and connect with groups where we feel seen and heard. By doing so, we become more aware of our stressors in addition to trauma that is passed down through generations and truly begin the healing process. I would also like to remind our listeners that CSULB's Counseling and Psychological Services, also known as CAPS, offers programs such as Beachbuddy to provide peer mentoring, as well as drop-in support spaces for individuals and groups by our counselors. You can check out CAPS, Project Ocean, and Beach Buddies on our social media pages to stay updated with more information on our services, events, and other information on mental health and wellness. Again, this is Valena from Project Ocean, and I'd like to thank you for listening in on our topic of stress through the lens of intergenerational trauma, culture, and family.